The report arrived before dawn, carried by a courier who had not slept. It was stamped urgent, not out of fear, but because what it described did not belong to the plan already approved. Ahead of the German spearhead, the ground was not thin. It was layered. It was measured. It was waiting. The reconnaissance unit had moved carefully, probing where doctrine said there should be weakness. Instead, they found depth. Trenches dug beyond the first line, minefields laid not as obstacles, but as systems. Artillery positions already calibrated, their firing data prepared in advance. Nothing about the enemy posture suggested surprise. Everything suggested anticipation. By the time the report reached headquarters, belief had already hardened into certainty. Maps lay spread across tables, marked with confident arrows pointing east. The enemy, as understood by command, was still disorganized, still reactive, still inferior. The Recon report did not fit that picture. It threatened it. The language was precise. There was no exaggeration, no alarm, just observation, depth instead of frontage, density instead of gaps, preparation instead of weakness. It implied something uncomfortable, that the Red Army had not waited to be attacked, but had prepared to receive the attack on its own terms. Staff officers skimmed the pages quickly, not because they suspected error, but because accepting the report would force a pause, and pausing now would mean reopening decisions already made. Fuel schedules, march tables, artillery plans. The operation had momentum, and momentum has gravity. No clarification was requested, no additional reconnaissance ordered. The commander did not ask what else lay unseen. Orders issued the night before remained in force, untouched by what the ground was quietly revealing. As engines began to start and columns formed for the advance, the warning lost its last chance to matter. The offensive moved forward exactly as planned, guided by maps drawn from confidence rather than reality. And somewhere ahead, beyond the first line, a battlefield waited that had been built for an enemy who refused to listen. German command culture did not form overnight. It was shaped by years in which boldness had been rewarded and hesitation punished. From Poland to France, from the opening months in the East, speed had solved problems before they fully revealed themselves. When uncertainty appeared, momentum erased it. This history did not merely inform decisions, it disciplined them. In that culture, reconnaissance was a tool, not an authority. Reports were useful when they confirmed expectation. When they did not, memory intervened. Warnings had come before, and many had proven exaggerated. Enemy strength had often dissolved once pressure was applied. Experience taught that the fastest answer to doubt was movement. The Red Army, in particular, remained trapped in an older mental image. Large, numerous, resilient, but slow, capable of endurance, not anticipation. German planners still believed the enemy reacted to blows rather than shaping the field in advance. Preparation on a deep operational scale was not impossible, but it was not expected. Maps reflected this belief. They showed fronts to be pierced, not zones to be absorbed. Defensive depth was compressed into thin lines. Open spaces appeared where doctrine assumed collapse would occur. These were not errors of cartography. They were expressions of confidence. The timetable mattered more than the terrain. Each hour was accounted for, each phase dependent on the last. Delays threatened not only synchronization, but authority. Once set, the schedule became more than a plan, it became a promise. To question it was to question the logic of the operation itself. In such an environment, doubt did not sound like prudence. It sounded like weakness, like fear disguised as caution. Command had learned that wars were not won by those who waited to be certain. And so belief hardened into procedure. Speed would compensate again. It always had. What lay ahead, they assumed would bend, because it always had before. Delaying an offensive is rarely a technical decision. It is a moral one. The maps may allow it, the fuel may support it, and the troops may even benefit from it. But the responsibility for hesitation belongs to a single name. In armies built on momentum, delay does not feel like caution. It feels like betrayal. Officers understood this instinctively. To interrupt the timetable was to expose oneself to blame before the outcome was known. If the attack succeeded, the man who urged patience would be remembered as an obstacle. If it failed, he would be remembered as insufficiently bold. Momentum, once promised, demanded loyalty. The reconnaissance officers who raised concerns occupied the weakest position in this hierarchy. They were junior, precise, and trained to doubt. Their role was to observe, not to decide. Their warnings arrived stripped of authority, carried in measured language that lacked urgency because it lacked exaggeration. In a culture that rewarded certainty, caution sounded unconvincing. Optimism, by contrast, moved easily. Reports that aligned with expectation traveled upward without friction. Each retelling softened uncertainty and sharpened confidence. By the time information reached senior levels, it often reflected what leaders already believed rather than what the ground had revealed. No one wanted to be the voice that interrupted success. The operation was not merely planned, it was anticipated. Careers, reputations, and institutional pride were bound to its execution. Arguing against it required not tactical brilliance, but the willingness to stand alone. That willingness never materialized. Meetings ended without objection. Orders moved forward unchanged. Silence filled the space where debate should have existed, and silence was mistaken for agreement. The warning did not spark a confrontation. It did not provoke a decision. It simply faded, absorbed by procedure, buried under confidence, and forgotten without ceremony. And with it disappeared the last chance to slow what was already moving too fast. Erich von Manstein did not reach his position by accident. He was confident, methodical, and widely respected within the German High Command. His reputation rested on results, on campaigns where audacity had produced clarity and movement had restored initiative. He was not reckless, but he had learned, through experience, that hesitation rarely rewarded those who practiced it. His career had unfolded in an army that prized decision above deliberation. From operational breakthroughs to encirclements executed under pressure, boldness had consistently delivered success. Caution, by contrast, had offered little evidence of its value. In this environment, confidence was not arrogance, it was professional memory. Manstein believed deeply in momentum. He understood war as a contest of reactions, where one side imposed tempo and the other struggled to respond. In his view, the enemy reacted to force. It did not shape the battlefield in advance. The Red Army, though improved, was still seen as an opponent that absorbed blows rather than anticipated them. Preparation on the scale suggested by reconnaissance felt excessive, unlikely. Intelligence, therefore, had a defined place. Reconnaissance existed to support operations already conceived, not to redefine them. Reports were meant to refine routes, confirm expectations, and adjust details at the margins. They were not meant to challenge the foundation of an approved plan. That foundation, once set, carried its own authority. Adjusting the operation now felt unnecessary. The pieces were already moving. Units were staged, timetables synchronized, and supply columns committed. To pause would not simply delay the attack, it would unravel coherence. Momentum, once interrupted, was difficult to rebuild, and momentum had always been his ally. The operation promised something decisive, a clean break, a restored initiative, not a cautious probe or an incremental adjustment, but an action that would resolve uncertainty by force. Delay threatened that promise. It transformed clarity into doubt. Manstein did not ignore reconnaissance out of disdain. He simply trusted the pattern that had guided him before. The enemy would respond once struck. Resistance would thin under pressure. Speed would again compensate for what could not be known in advance. And so the decision was made, not dramatically, not defiantly, but with calm assurance. The plan remained intact. The timetable held. Orders were confirmed. Momentum, once trusted, was allowed to carry everything forward. While German headquarters debated speed and momentum, the ground ahead remained quiet. There was no urgency on the Soviet side, no visible rush to meet the coming blow. Months earlier, Engineers of the Red Army had begun their work with patience rather than alarm. This was not a defense built in response to panic. It was a defense constructed with time. The landscape was reshaped deliberately. Trenches were dug not as a single line, but as a system, forward positions to absorb contact, secondary belts to slow movement, and deeper zones designed to hold firepower intact. Each layer existed to buy time, trade space, and preserve strength. There was no expectation of stopping the enemy at the edge. The goal was to draw him inward. Minefields formed the skeleton of this design. They were not scattered obstacles, but continuous belts measured in kilometers. Anti-tank mines, anti-personnel charges, and booby traps were arranged to channel movement rather than simply deny it. Clearing one path only exposed another. Progress would be paid for in time, equipment, and certainty. Artillery transformed preparation into lethality. Guns were positioned, calibrated, and registered long before the first German vehicle moved. Firing data was calculated in advance, adjusted for range, elevation, and likely avenues of approach. When the time came, Soviet gunners would not search for targets. They would engage coordinates already memorized. Camouflage concealed the scale of this effort. Earth was shaped to look untouched. Positions were hidden beneath netting, foliage, and deception works that defeated aerial reconnaissance. From above, the battlefield appeared ordinary, empty in places where it was most dangerous. German pilots saw no massed formations, no obvious concentrations. What they missed was intentional. Behind the visible defenses, reserves waited. Entire formations were held beyond the range of immediate contact, positioned to move once the attacker had committed. These forces were not meant to repel the first assault. They were meant to decide the moment that followed it. The trap was not subtle. It was comprehensive, but it relied on one assumption, that the enemy would advance as planned, trusting momentum to solve what observation could not. When the advance began, it did so with confidence forged in steel. German armored columns rolled forward not as experiments, but as proofs. Crews trusted their machines, and commanders trusted the record those machines represented. The spearhead was modern, powerful, and designed to dominate the battlefield through force and precision. The Panther and Tiger tanks embodied that confidence. Their armor promised protection. Their guns promised reach. To the men inside them, they felt decisive before the first shot was fired. These were not improvised tools. They were the result of hard lessons learned earlier in the war, refined to restore superiority. Against such weapons, preparation was expected to break. Quality had long been Germany's answer to numerical and material limits. Superior engineering, better optics, longer range. These advantages were assumed to compensate for whatever the enemy had built in advance. Preparation could be impressive, but it was static. Armor was dynamic, and in German doctrine, movement always defeated position. Breakthrough was treated not as a possibility, but as an outcome. The question was not whether the line would be pierced, but how quickly exploitation would follow. Once penetration occurred, the enemy would be forced to react, reserves rushed forward, cohesion strained. That was how the system worked. It had worked before. Logistics reflected this belief. Fuel, ammunition, and recovery assets were allocated for forward progress, not prolonged friction. Repair units were positioned to support advance, not extraction. Timetables assumed roads would open, not close. Delay was not planned for because delay was not expected. As the columns moved, reconnaissance faded into the background. Its role had been to inform the opening move. Now that movement had begun, observation was subordinate to execution. The front was no longer something to be studied. It was something to be crossed. Momentum took over. Engines, tracks, and orders pushed events forward faster than reflection could follow. Reports from the front began to arrive, but they were filtered through expectation. Slowness was temporary. Resistance was localized. Nothing yet demanded reconsideration. To pause now would be to admit that the assumptions guiding the operation might be flawed, and flawed assumptions threatened more than the timetable. They threatened the logic of armored warfare itself. the belief that speed, force, and confidence could still impose reality on the battlefield. So the advance continued. Steel pressed forward into ground already measured by someone else. Confidence filled the space where uncertainty might have lived. What the armor did not yet know was that preparation does not need to defeat quality outright. It only needs to stop it long enough for time to change sides. The first sign did not come as a crisis. It came as a delay. Lead units slowed far earlier than the timetable allowed, not because of confusion, but because movement itself became difficult. Tracks churned where roads were expected to open. Columns compressed, then paused. The advance continued, but not at the speed it was meant to. Then the mines appeared. Not scattered, not random, but positioned exactly where doctrine assumed freedom of movement. Detonations lifted tanks without warning, tearing tracks from hulls and turning momentum into obstruction. Crews reacted instinctively, dismounting to assess damage, only to find that the ground itself had been engineered against them. Recovery vehicles moved forward to clear lanes. They became targets almost immediately. Artillery fire arrived not as probing shots, but as accurate strikes on known positions. Cranes burned. Half-cleared paths closed again under fire. What was meant to be a brief interruption began to stretch into hours. Infantry advanced to screen the armor and suppress resistance. Instead, they encountered fire that felt calculated. Soviet artillery did not barrage blindly. It engaged when movement concentrated, when vehicles clustered, when engineers exposed themselves. The timing suggested pre-measured solutions rather than reaction. Radio traffic increased, but its tone remained controlled. There was no panic, no calls of collapse. Reports were careful, professional, restrained. Units described resistance that was heavier than expected. Delays that felt structural, not accidental. Mines where maps showed none. Guns that seemed to know where to aim. Commanders at the front began to sense a pattern. The enemy was not improvising. He was allowing the advance to enter spaces already prepared. Each obstacle did not stand alone. It connected to another, deeper, more costly. Clearing one problem revealed the outline of the next. Still, no one spoke of failure. The language remained technical. Progress was slow, but ongoing. Losses were acceptable, so far. Adjustments were made. Alternate routes attempted. The assumption persisted that once the first belt was broken, resistance would thin and speed would return. But speed did not return. Hours passed. Fuel consumption rose. Ammunition expenditure increased. Vehicles waited with engines running, exposed longer than planned. Every delay created new targets. Every pause allowed Soviet fire to recalibrate. What should have been transient friction began to feel deliberate. Momentum, once so reliable, began to bleed away quietly. Not in a single rupture, but through accumulation. Minutes became hours. Hours became vulnerability. The advance no longer dictated tempo. It responded to it. By the end of the first phase, officers could not explain the resistance in simple terms. It was not the volume of fire alone. It was its placement, not the number of mines, but their depth. The enemy was not merely defending ground, he was managing time. Yet belief still held. This was only the outer layer. The system would still work. It had to. What no one could yet see was how much of the plan depended on speed, and how quickly that advantage was slipping beyond recovery. German armored tactics were built on a simple truth: movement is protection. A tank that advances forces the enemy to react, disrupts aim, and compresses decision-making into seconds. Speed is not only an operational concept, it is a form of armor. But now, on this ground, movement became restricted, and the entire logic of the advance began to unravel. The mine belts did not merely destroy vehicles, they forced pauses, and every pause turned German strength into exposure. Mine-clearing teams moved forward under pressure, probing soil that had been seeded with methodical care. Each lane cleared demanded time, tools, and courage. And each lane, once identified, became predictable, an inevitable funnel into which Soviet guns could aim. Artillery fire began to feel unnaturally accurate, not because of supernatural skill, but because it was planned. Soviet batteries did not have to guess where German armor would concentrate. The battlefield itself guided it. The moment vehicles clustered behind a halted lead tank, the coordinates became obvious. Fire arrived with speed that suggested pre-registered targets. German crews learned that safety did not exist in stillness. Air support, once a tool of flexibility, struggled here. From above, the ground offered few clear signatures. Soviet camouflage did what it was designed to do. It made the battlefield look ordinary. Gun pits blended into fields. Reserve formations stayed beyond visible reach. Smoke, dust, and the flat distance of the steppe made targets hard to confirm. Aircraft could strike the obvious, but the obvious was rarely decisive. On the ground, commanders improvised. They had no choice. Routes were altered, assaults redirected, engineers reassigned, infantry pushed forward to cover gaps that should not have existed. These were competent decisions, made under pressure by men trained for complexity. But improvisation has limits when the enemy's design is deeper than the attacker's understanding. The problem was not one minefield or one gun line. It was depth. Each time German units pushed past an obstacle, they found another behind it. Progress became measurable only in meters, and each meter was paid for with fuel, time, and machinery that could not be easily replaced. Losses rose without the psychological reward of visible breakthrough. The battlefield remained intact even as German vehicles burned. This was the moment when speed stopped working. Not because German forces forgot how to move, but because the environment no longer allowed movement to function as protection. The defender had transformed geography into a weapon. He did not need to defeat armor in open battle. He only needed to slow it, hold it, and let time do what shells could not accomplish alone. And time, for the first time in the operation, began to favor the defender. Every hour spent clearing lanes was an hour Soviet reserves remained uncommitted. Every stalled column was an invitation for artillery to reset and strike again. Every delayed timetable eroded the assumptions that had justified the offensive in the first place. The plan had been built to win quickly. It was now being forced to survive slowly. German units continued to advance because stopping felt impossible. But the nature of their advance had changed. It was no longer a thrust. It was a grind against a defense that seemed to grow deeper the more it was tested. And somewhere inside headquarters, a question began to form that no one wanted to say aloud. If this was only the outer belt, what lay beyond it? The warning returned not as a revelation, but as confirmation. New intelligence arrived from multiple directions: signals intercepts, prisoner interrogations, forward unit reports, and together they formed a picture that was no longer dismissible. The defenses ahead were not thinning, they were extending. What reconnaissance had warned of before the first shot was now being encountered in fragments, piece by costly piece. Staff officers revised their estimates reluctantly. Defensive belts stretched far beyond the original calculations, not as isolated positions, but as an integrated system. What had been labeled the main line of resistance revealed itself as only the beginning. Behind it lay additional zones, each prepared to absorb pressure and preserve combat power. The battlefield was deeper than the plan had ever allowed for. As losses mounted, German commanders reached for their reserves. These formations had been intended for exploitation, for the moment after breakthrough, when speed would return and the enemy would fracture. Instead, they were committed to sustain momentum that no longer existed. Units meant to decide the operation were used to prevent it from stalling completely. This early commitment carried consequences. Reserves fed into a constrained front had little room to maneuver. They entered a battle already shaped by the defender, forced into lanes defined by minefields and fire plans. What should have restored initiative merely prolonged exposure. Equipment losses accelerated, not through catastrophic defeat, but through accumulation. One disabled tank, one destroyed recovery vehicle, one crew lost at a time. The numbers began to matter. Tanks knocked out faster than they could be recovered. Spare parts consumed faster than they could be delivered. Fuel burned while waiting rather than advancing. Each loss reduced not just strength, but flexibility. The margin for adjustment narrowed with every hour. Reports from the front changed in tone. They remained disciplined, but the language shifted. Words like temporary and localized gave way to persistent and systematic. Breakthrough, once assumed, now appeared conditional, then improbable, then distant. The operation no longer promised decision, it demanded endurance. Within headquarters, withdrawal was discussed, not openly and not decisively, but as a possibility. Pulling back would preserve forces, but it would also concede initiative. It would acknowledge that the assumptions underlying the offensive were flawed, and once acknowledged, those assumptions could not be restored. The discussion ended without resolution. The moment passed. The advance continued, not because confidence had returned, but because stopping seemed more dangerous than pressing on. To withdraw under pressure risked exposing columns to fire. To pause risked admitting failure. The offensive moved forward by inertia alone. Meanwhile, the enemy adjusted calmly. Soviet reserves remained largely intact, their commitment timed rather than rushed. Artillery continued to dominate the rhythm of the battle. The defender did not need to hurry. Every German attempt to regain momentum only deepened his entanglement. Initiative slipped away quietly. There was no single order that surrendered it, no dramatic reversal. It passed in increments, through delays, through forced decisions, through the early use of resources meant for later phases. By the time it was recognized, it was already gone. The warning that had once been inconvenient now read like a blueprint. Depth, density, preparation. Each word found its reflection on the ground. What had been ignored before the offensive now defined it. And with that realization came a deeper, more troubling question. If the enemy had prepared this thoroughly, then this battle was not an interruption of his plans. It was the opening move of them. Midway through the operation, the maps began to change. Not dramatically, and not all at once, but through quiet revisions made at crowded tables under dim light. New symbols appeared where blank space had once been assumed. Defensive belts were extended. Depth was added. What had been drawn as a narrow obstacle was redrawn as a system. These changes were not theoretical. They were based on loss reports, stalled units, and fragments of intelligence gathered under fire. Each update forced a reassessment of the original assumptions, and with every reassessment, the logic of the plan weakened. The battlefield no longer resembled the one the operation had been designed to cross. What became clear was not merely that resistance was heavier than expected. It was that the enemy had not been surprised at all. The Red Army had not reacted to the offensive, it had absorbed it. The defenses encountered were not improvised responses, but prearranged solutions. The attacker had moved into a structure already complete. This realization carried weight beyond tactics. Surprise had been central to the plan's promise. Speed had been meant to exploit confusion, but there was no confusion to exploit. The defender had anticipated avenues of approach, accepted initial losses, and preserved strength where it mattered most. The offensive had not disrupted Soviet intentions, it had activated them. Command now faced a narrowing set of choices. Pushing forward remained possible, but only at increasing cost. Every kilometer gained required time, equipment, and crews that could not be easily replaced. Progress no longer promised decision, it promised attrition. Forward movement became an exchange measured in losses rather than advantage. Pulling back offered no clarity either. Withdrawal under pressure risked exposing columns to artillery and air attack. It would concede ground already paid for and confirm that the operation had failed to achieve its aims. Worse still, it would leave the initiative firmly in enemy hands. A retreat might preserve forces, but it would not restore freedom of action. Neither option offered momentum. One prolonged damage, the other acknowledged it. Staff discussions grew more constrained. There was no longer talk of exploitation or decisive maneuver. The language shifted to stabilization, consolidation, and holding actions. The operation's vocabulary itself revealed its condition. What had begun as an offensive now required justification simply to continue. The revised maps told a story the original ones had not allowed. The enemy's depth forced German units to fight in confined corridors where technical superiority mattered less and exposure mattered more. Firepower could destroy targets, but it could not collapse the system as a whole. Every gain existed inside a framework that favored the defender. This was the turning point, not marked by a single order or a dramatic reversal, but by understanding. The moment command accepted that the battlefield could not be reshaped by will alone, that belief, not resistance, had been the first thing to fail. The offensive still moved, orders were still issued, units still fought with discipline and skill, but the principle that had justified the operation, rapid decision through momentum, was gone. What remained was effort without leverage. From this point forward, the question was no longer how to win quickly. It was how to avoid losing decisively. The maps had finally caught up to reality, and in doing so, they revealed something that could not be corrected with revision. The offensive had failed, not in execution, but in conception. The shift was subtle at first. There was no sudden surge, no dramatic wave of movement. Instead, the Red Army began to change posture. Defensive fire grew more confident. Artillery patterns adjusted. What had once been reactive became deliberate. The moment the German offensive lost momentum, the defender no longer needed to wait. German units found themselves fixed in place. Minefields, destroyed vehicles, and cratered ground limited maneuver, compressing armor into narrow corridors already defined by Soviet planning. What had been intended as temporary halts became semi-permanent positions. Tanks that were meant to exploit now existed primarily to survive. Artillery dominance asserted itself with increasing clarity. Soviet guns fired not in desperation, but in sequence. Barrages were timed to movement, to recovery attempts, to assembly points identified through repetition. The battlefield became predictable in a way that favored the side that had designed it. Firepower no longer disrupted, it controlled. German armor, once the instrument of decision, was forced into prepared kill zones. These were not traps sprung suddenly, but spaces engineered over time. Open ground invited movement, movement invited fire. Each advance required concentration. Each concentration drew shells. Armor could still fight, but it could not choose where or how. As losses accumulated, command cohesion began to weaken. Orders issued from higher headquarters took longer to reach the front, and when they arrived, conditions had already changed. Units improvised locally, sometimes successfully, often at cost. Coordination frayed not because of incompetence, but because the environment punished synchronization. The battlefield stopped responding to intent. Planned maneuvers stalled. Countermeasures produced limited effect. The operational language of command, advance, exploit, breakthrough, no longer matched what units could physically accomplish. Control narrowed from operational to tactical, from orchestration to survival. Soviet counterattacks followed the same logic as their defense. They were limited, controlled, and timed. Infantry advanced under artillery cover to retake ground not for symbolism, but for position. Armor appeared where German forces were weakest, not to pursue, but to seal space and deny movement. Each action reinforced the larger design. For German commanders, the disaster became visible not in a single collapse, but in the pattern of events. Losses rose without corresponding gain. Units reported exhaustion rather than progress. Equipment shortages intersected with terrain and fire in ways that could not be solved by adjustment alone. The battle had crossed a threshold. The initiative was no longer contested. It had changed hands. What made this moment decisive was not the scale of Soviet movement, but its timing. The counterattack did not attempt to annihilate the German force. It aimed to lock it in place, drain it, and ensure that recovery would be slow and costly. Victory was measured in control, not conquest. From this point onward, German actions were shaped by necessity rather than design. Decisions reacted to pressure instead of imposing it. The offensive spirit that had driven the operation dissolved into a series of defensive calculations. The battlefield, once expected to bend under speed and steel, now dictated terms. Orders still flowed. Units still fought with discipline. But the system that had promised decision no longer functioned. The disaster was no longer theoretical. It was visible, measurable, and unfolding in real time. And once visible, it could not be undone. The withdrawal did not resemble a rout. German units pulled back with discipline, guided by orders that emphasized control over speed. Columns moved deliberately, covering one another, extracting what could still move and destroying what could not. There was no panic in the ranks, only exhaustion and calculation. This was an army that still knew how to disengage. The damage, however, was already done. The retreat did not erase what had been lost, it merely preserved what remained. The failure was operational, not catastrophic, but in a war of attrition, operational damage carried strategic weight. The offensive had not collapsed spectacularly, it had been spent. Tanks were abandoned or destroyed in numbers that could not be quietly absorbed. Mechanical failures compounded combat losses. Recovery under fire proved costly, and many vehicles were left behind to prevent greater risk. Each loss mattered now, not as an isolated incident, but as part of a shrinking reserve of strength. More irreplaceable still were the crews. Veteran tank commanders, gunners, and drivers, men trained through years of combat, disappeared from the rolls. Some were killed. Others were wounded beyond return. Their absence hollowed out units that still existed on paper. Machines could be replaced, eventually. Experience could not. The Red Army did not pursue recklessly. It did not need to. Initiative already belonged to the defender-turned-attacker. Soviet forces advanced selectively, consolidating ground that mattered and pressuring withdrawals just enough to shape them. The enemy dictated the rhythm now, not through speed, but through control. As German forces fell back, the front stabilized on Soviet terms. New defensive lines were established, but they were reactive rather than chosen. Terrain that might once have been traded for time now had to be held. The operational freedom that had defined earlier campaigns was gone. This stabilization carried meaning beyond the immediate battlefield. It marked a shift in balance. The Germans had entered the operation seeking decision. They emerged seeking containment. The Red Army, once expected to absorb blows and recover slowly, now held the initiative across a widened front. The withdrawal preserved cohesion, but it could not preserve illusion. The assumption that momentum could always be regained no longer held. Each retreat reduced the margin for future operations. Each stabilized line became a reminder that recovery would be measured, not rapid. What had changed was not just ground, but expectation. German command now planned with caution where it once planned with confidence. Future offensives would be smaller, more constrained, and burdened by the memory of this failure. Strategic freedom had narrowed. The war did not end here. Armies remained. Battles would follow. But the balance had shifted in ways that could not be reversed by discipline alone. The moment for decisive action had passed, and it would not return. The retreat ended without collapse, but it marked the point at which Germany ceased to dictate the course of the war. The losses inflicted during the operation did not end with the withdrawal. They continued to matter long after the front stabilized. German industry, already strained, could not replace what had been lost at the rate required. New tanks rolled off assembly lines, but not in the numbers needed to restore strength, and not with crews trained to use them to full effect. Production could not erase depletion. On the other side of the front, the contrast was stark. Soviet factories continued without interruption. Dispersed, protected, and driven by scale, their output absorbed losses and replaced them with speed that Germany could no longer match. The war of movement had become a war of endurance, and endurance favored the side that could lose and recover simultaneously. What proved most costly was not steel, but experience. Veteran crews had carried doctrine in their instincts. They knew how to read terrain, when to push, when to pause, when to disengage. Their absence changed units more profoundly than any equipment shortage. New crews filled seats, but not gaps in judgment. The difference showed under fire. This was where tactical brilliance met material reality. German command still possessed skill, discipline, and innovation, but skill without margin becomes fragile. Each future operation had to be planned around what could not be risked rather than what could be gained. Aggression gave way to calculation. Calculation gave way to restraint. Future offensives reflected this shift. They were narrower, more conditional, and burdened by contingency. Reserves were held back longer. Intelligence was scrutinized more carefully. Timetables grew flexible. These were signs not of collapse but of contraction, strategic freedom, the ability to choose when and where to impose battle, had diminished. The initiative now belonged to the opponent. The Red Army could plan offensives knowing that German forces lacked the depth to absorb failure and recover quickly. Pressure no longer needed to be decisive. It only needed to be sustained. Time had become an ally. In hindsight, attention returned to the beginning. The Recon report, once inconvenient, was reread with a different eye. Its language now seemed precise rather than cautious. Depth, density, preparation. Each word matched the outcome. What had been dismissed as pessimism revealed itself as accuracy. The report did not predict defeat. It predicted conditions. Those conditions had unfolded exactly as described. The failure lay not in execution alone, but in interpretation, in the belief that momentum could override preparation. This recognition carried an uncomfortable lesson. Intelligence had been available. Observation had been offered. The cost of ignoring it was not immediate catastrophe, but irreversible erosion. Losses accumulated where replacement was impossible, and caution replaced confidence where freedom had once existed. The report gained weight not because it was dramatic, but because it had been correct. And correctness, in war, often reveals itself only when it is too late to act upon it. What remained was a front held, an army diminished, and a realization that the balance had shifted, not through surprise, but through certainty misplaced. Intelligence by itself has no power. It does not stop an attack, redirect a formation, or cancel an order. It only offers a choice. And that choice matters only if the intelligence is believed. When belief is absent, even the clearest warning becomes inert, accurate, detailed, and irrelevant. Confident armies struggle with this more than weak ones. Success creates its own logic. Victories harden into patterns, and patterns become assumptions. Over time, experience stops being a tool for interpretation and becomes a filter that excludes contradiction. What fits is accepted. What challenges is discounted. Doctrine plays a central role in this process. It is built from lessons learned at great cost, refined through repetition, and validated by results. But doctrine is descriptive, not prophetic. It explains what has worked, not what must work again. When commanders begin to trust doctrine more than observation, intelligence becomes subordinate to expectation. Reconnaissance exists at the edge of certainty. It sees fragments, not conclusions. Its language is careful by necessity. It speaks in probabilities, tendencies, and risks. In confident command cultures, that tone can sound unconvincing. Warning lacks the authority of success. It arrives without guarantees. As a result, warning often sounds like weakness, like fear, like an attempt to slow what should be decisive. In systems that reward momentum, caution threatens identity. It challenges not just a plan, but the self-image of those who designed it. And so it is easier to question the messenger than the message. War punishes this instinct relentlessly. It does not negotiate with belief. It responds only to reality. Preparation defeats assumption. Patience defeats momentum. Certainty becomes vulnerability when it prevents adaptation. The battlefield does not care how often a method has worked before. It only responds to conditions as they exist now. This pattern repeats across history. Armies that win early often struggle later, not because they forget how to fight, but because they forget how to listen. Intelligence failures rarely stem from ignorance. They stem from confidence, specifically from the refusal to let new information disrupt established belief. What makes these failures enduring is how clear they appear afterward. Once outcomes are known, the warning stands out sharply. The report reads like prophecy. The ignored detail becomes decisive in hindsight. The path not taken appears obvious. But it was never obvious at the time. It competed with reputation, momentum, and institutional memory. Choosing to believe it would have required restraint where boldness was expected, delay where speed was rewarded, doubt where confidence had always paid off. Reconnaissance does not fail because it is wrong. It fails because it asks for change, and change is expensive in systems built on certainty. The cost is not measured immediately. It accumulates quietly through lost options and narrowing margins. By the time belief yields to reality, choice has already been replaced by necessity. The battlefield enforces its own correction, and it does so without concern for intention. This is why intelligence failures feel tragic rather than foolish. The information was there, the warning was clear, the mistake was human. And once made, it is always obvious afterward. After the fighting had moved on and the front had settled into new lines, the report was read again. Not in haste this time, not as an interruption. It was read in full, line by line, with the patience that only hindsight allows. What it described no longer felt inconvenient. It felt precise. Every warning matched the outcome, the depth that had slowed the advance, the density that had absorbed fire, the preparation that had turned movement into exposure. Nothing in the report had promised catastrophe. It had simply described conditions. Those conditions had unfolded exactly as written. There was no single moment that decided the battle, no shell that broke the offensive, no order that doomed it. The failure emerged through accumulation, through delays that compounded, losses that narrowed options, and assumptions that resisted correction. The battlefield did not deliver a verdict all at once. It revealed it gradually. What failed was not courage, competence, or discipline. German units fought with skill and endurance throughout. Command decisions were rational within the framework that shaped them. The collapse came earlier, at the moment belief overruled observation, when confidence displaced listening. The war, of course, continued. Battles followed. Lines shifted. Armies endured. But advantage did not return. What had been spent in that operation, initiative, experience, flexibility, could not be recovered through effort alone. From that point forward, Germany reacted more often than it imposed. The tempo belonged elsewhere. This is the cost of not listening. Not immediate destruction, but irreversible narrowing. The loss of choice. The moment when options become reactions and reactions become necessities. By the time reality forced acknowledgement, the freedom to respond creatively had already vanished. The Recon report had not demanded surrender. It had asked for pause, for adjustment, for the humility to accept that the enemy had changed. That pause never came. The moment passed while engines turned and columns advanced. In war, moments matter more than intentions. Once missed, they do not return. Certainty feels like strength. It simplifies decisions and accelerates action. But certainty that cannot absorb contradiction becomes brittle. When it breaks completely, leaving no space to adapt. Observation, by contrast, is slow and uncomfortable. It demands restraint where momentum feels safer. They ignored the report not because it lacked clarity, but because it challenged identity. It asked leaders to doubt what had always worked. And in that refusal, certainty became the most dangerous assumption of all. The disaster did not arrive suddenly. It was walked into, step by step, kilometer by kilometer, guided by confidence that could not imagine being wrong. They laughed at no warning. They dismissed no truth. They simply did not listen. And by the time the battlefield spoke clearly enough to be believed, the answer had already been decided.